Thank you again, Barbara and Jim, for such a stimulating introduction and invitation into these topics. Thank you also, Peter, for making possible this part of it and the meeting of these concepts, because there's a lot at the edges of both of your talks that are relevant to our time. So I just want to say thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for questions. Please keep them coming. There's a lot to get into here. And I think it might be that. There was something that was said earlier about the question about, can big be beautiful too? And I thought that was a very interesting kind of intro into this topic. And I'm wondering whether would Schumacher have agreed that big is beautiful? How would this relationship between big and small be dealt with if Schumacher were here today to speak about this interaction between the levels?
Well, do I use this? Yeah. Small is Beautiful was, of course, a wonderful title, but it doesn't mean that everything has to be small. Things have to be appropriate sizes. So there are some things that need to be bigger. It's to do with human size, the small is beautiful bit, really, that where human beings can flourish in their work and so on, so that they're not machine minders and treated like robots. But if it's more appropriate that something's at a larger scale, then big can be beautiful. But as you were saying, there's a chapter in Small is Beautiful about the National Coal Board, and his whole striving there was to try and have smaller units within the big. So yes, so big can be beautiful, but it has to be always the place of the human being in it is the fundamental thing.
Yeah, I would just say, in a way, just repeating what we've already said, that Small is Beautiful was a great title. Decentralized and deconcentrated is beautiful would have been a bit clumsier, but I think that was really what he was talking about in the book, was size as an indicator or proxy for something else, which had to do with the concentration of power and wealth in a few hands. And so I think you could call the idea of carving dividends small increments of money being distributed to everybody as a result of universal property, their common ownership of that limited carbon absorptive capacity of the biosphere. But the overall architecture that you would need to put in place in order to have that is big. It's a big idea, and it requires not only individual efforts, it requires all of our efforts collectively. So that's what I wanted to provoke by asking if big could be beautiful. I'm not an untrammeled advocate of bigness for its own sake, of course.
But actually, Small is Beautiful was not his title.
Really?
It was the publisher's title. He wanted to call it The Homecomers.
The Homecomers. Can you say more about what that...
Well, I think that fits in with the whole, the spiritual content of it, of coming back to what not a sort of romantic going back to old times, but having that, coming home to ideas that are fundamental for our whole civilization that we've discarded, the sorts of things that I was trying to say in my talk.
But I think the publisher probably was smart in picking that title, right? I mean, especially if I think back to that time, the early 70s, there was a reaction going on all around the world against both big capital, big corporations, and big government. And that title really spoke to that moment.
Absolutely.
This is fantastic. Thank you very much for sending these in. I'm going to be reading. I hope it's not impolite if I read as I also listen. There are a number of questions coming in about universal basic income, and I wonder if you can, Barbara, I very much appreciated in your talk the ways in which you pointed to not just the economics here, but the spirituality and the question of values, and the ways in which values and utility can come into tension or productive creation in our world. And I'm curious, and I don't know if you go by James or Jim. Jim.
That's fine.
It was interesting that you said that the Democrats took up the cap and trade, but cap and dividend didn't get traction. And I'm wondering, is there an underlying values framework or story or narrative that the cap and dividend was coming up against that we have to contend with in order to make something like this possible?
I'd say that probably more in the minds of the people who were pushing the cap and trade approach was what they would have thought as a kind of realpolitik. I remember being on a conference call. You may have been on it as well, Peter. I've written about this briefly in the book. There was had some people who were for the cap and trade. These were kind of inside the beltway enviro activists, and a few of us who were for the cap and dividend alternative, which was, we were pushing for at that time. And the former, the inside the beltway, big environmental NGO people who were behind Waxman Markey said, well, you don't understand, we've got to give this money to the oil companies, to the fossil fuel companies, the coal companies, through free permits that they can then trade among themselves. We've got to do that because otherwise they'll deploy their lobbyists and they will defeat the legislation, right? So they said, you've got to think about their interests. And so I said, well, what about the interests of the American people? The ones who would be footing the bill for the higher fuel prices and who would ultimately need to support this. So they said, oh, I'm an armchair academic, sitting in a little town, New England town. I said, no, you don't understand here in Washington. It's not the voters that matter. It's the lobbyists that matter. So I said to them, some of you may be familiar with the economist joke about let us assume it can't open. I said, well, let us assume a democracy. And they just laughed. They thought that was hilarious, So you could say that's a question of values, but you could also say they just had this was their vision of how politics worked, was you needed to reach an agreement with those on the other side, which I think is often true. But in this case, the other side was the fossil fuel companies, who, if you're talking about phasing out fossil fuels, that's a devil's bargain. I don't think you can make a bargain with these people, frankly. I think you have to defeat them.
It is a day of protest.
Yes.
There's actually a helpful combination and themes that I see woven together in the questions that I'm seeing. And Barbara, you used the word non-PC, which I think was appropriate. I remember reading the Guide for the Perplexed and being struck by certain dimensions around, there's a question here about human exceptionalism that is also at the heart of contemporary discussions about our relationship with nature, as part of nature rather than over nature. And I'm wondering if you would speak at all to the vertical dimension and whether that is an aspect that your father ever experienced any pushback on or engagement on? Is that a point of reflection? Because I think that in the contemporary ecological discussions, that would be one of the vertical dimension itself might be one of the non-PC parts of it. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I was interested that what you were talking about is that the sky belongs to everybody and the earth belongs to everybody, and I don't think he would have said that. I would have said it doesn't belong to any of us. That it was given to us. We haven't made it ourselves, and therefore, just when someone gives you a gift, you don't trash it. You care for it, and we are treating it as though it belonged to us, but it doesn't. It's given to us on trust, and we maintain it for the next generation and the next generation. And I think that's much more the way. I mean, I'm always hesitating to say what he would have thought, because he always came from a direction that nobody expected. But he talks about, nature, the creation. We certainly haven't made it ourselves. So he talks about it in religious terms in that way. And so yes, we have been given it on trust. And it's very interesting that many people, if you read the story of creation in Genesis, there are two stories, and the second one, the earth is given to Adam, and it says to care and cultivate, and everybody always thinks about the first one, about you have dominion over the earth, but actually we think we've got dominion, which means we can do what we like. Does that answer your question?
It does. Speaking as a theologian, I was so grateful that you point to those two, because there was the first version that was written by the priestly class,
Indeed.
and then the second version by the agrarian, from the agrarian voice, and what it means to serve and tend the soil, what it means to be Adamah, soil.
Indeed. And the first version is about the perfection and that it's all good, and it's very liturgical, but we need both.
So there's a connection there, because when I first saw the slide, which I really appreciated, the 2x2 with universal property, both of those words have some contentious meaning in current philosophical discourse and political discourse, and I'm curious about the property side of things, because that idea that it doesn't belong to any of us, I think probably many people here would resonate with that. And then we have this challenge of how to coordinate action together as a people. And so we have this fiction called property. And I'm wondering, Jim, if you can speak at all to this aspect of universal property, and whether there are tensions there that run up against challenges in the political sphere from being adopted, because it comes into conflict with our underlying narratives.
Yeah, it definitely is a narrative break, and it's a break from notions of property and belonging that we currently have, which all fit into those other boxes. It's sort of a missing box, And there's a famous line, I'm blanking out at this moment, to whom it's properly attributed, saying property is theft, right? But I think what we need to understand also is that lack of property can be theft, So the fact that there are no property rights governing use or access to the limited ability of the planet to absorb carbon emissions, that is treated as free and valueless and up for grabs, means that it is grabbed. And who grabs it? At whose expense? We have to think about that, right? So I think you can think of certain kinds of things that are not treated as property today, which really should be understood as whether you call it belonging to us all, or a gift of nature, or a gift of creation to us all, it's something that, as Barbara said, we didn't create it. We are fortunate enough to have it be part of the world we're born into, and it's our responsibility not to abuse, not to destroy it, and not to let anybody monopolize it, right? And so that's what I think we're trying to get at with the notion of universal property. Those characteristics of it being individual, that does have something in common with private property, right? Inalienable? No. Perfectly egalitarian? No. Those are total breaks from things we normally think of as property rights. They can be conveyed. They can be transferred from one to another. These are more like human rights, translated in the sphere of the economy and the environment, stewardship of the environment. So, I'm not deeply wedded to any particular language to describe these things. It's probably a process of coming up with ways to describe them. But the fact that we haven't had words for them has been a problem, because it means we all too often haven't talked about them in the past. Sorry?
Is it because we think in money when it comes to these things?
Yeah, I think there's a real resistance to the notion of monetary valuation of things, commoditization. One of the critiques one sometimes gets of, because we've been talking about these ideas for a while now. One of the critiques one sometimes gets is, if you're creating permits to import fossil fuels, right, and bring in carbon in the economy, you're commoditizing nature, and I don't think that's quite right. You're valuing it. You're not valuing nature at zero. You're valuing it and translating that value into meaningful things in the economy, which are prices. But a commodity is something that can be bought and sold. It's totally alienable, totally transferable. And what we're talking about here is not alienable, not transferable. It's sort of like the difference, if you think about parking meters as a way to address the problem of congestion of parking spaces, we put parking meters along the streets. I don't know if you have them here in Great Barrington. We've got them in Amherst, a lot of places, of course, they do, right? It's a way to limit congestion, right? Having parking meters, which means there's a price for using that limited parking space, doesn't mean you've commoditized the streets. The streets are not for sale, right? The streets are still there as public property, but the use of them for parking your car now has a price, right? And they're also rules. That's another thing. Sometimes people say, you need regulations too. Yeah, I'm not saying you don't need regulations as part of the policy mix, right? You can only park in certain places, certain times. You can't park in front of a parking meter. There's special slots for disabled people. All of those are part of the regulation system that goes with this, right? So it's not an alien idea, really, when you think about it. The idea of using rights and prices as a way to prevent the abuse of resources that I'll use the word belong to us all, like the streets.
That's great. I appreciate the spontaneous question, and I saw a hand up earlier. Would you, sir, like to?
Sure. I have a question about timing. A lot of us who have some gray have been involved in these things for a long period of time. I'm interested in how Schumacher dealt with the slow pace of change and the rest. I remember Earth Day. That's over, 50 years ago? And we really had answers to most of the questions. And we're still waiting to get them implemented. So it's an open question about how do you deal with the slow pace of change and still keep going spiritually, physically, financially, and all the other ways, and some advice and thinking about that.
Well, at the beginning, is it I think it's a book put together by Peter Gillingham that it starts off, I'm going to misquote this, but it's words to the effect that I can put up my little sail, but I've got to wait for the wind to blow. And so I've only once seen him right at the end of his life where he was a bit despondent and felt, yeah, everybody's talking about it, but people aren't doing anything. But I think, his whole philosophy was that we can all do something. However, small is beautiful. You start off small. If you think too big, then probably it will never get off the ground. And so, as I said right at the beginning, if we all light our candles, the light grows. And sometimes the wind comes and blows them out, and we might be in those sort of periods. But then we've got to put our hands around the candle and make sure the light, we've still got it alight. And I went to a wonderful lecture by the late chief rabbi in England, Jonathan Sacks, and he was talking about the difference between somebody who foretells the future and a prophet. And he said that someone who foretells the future, if what he says comes to pass, he's a success. But if what a prophet says comes to pass, he's a failure, because his job is to call people back and make them turn around so that what he sees is going to happen doesn't happen. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, my father was E.F. Schumacher, and people say that he's a prophet, and it's still, we're still on this roller coaster to catastrophe. Is he a failure? And he said, absolutely not. His time will come. His time will come. He was. So we have to keep, as that last quote, we have to. We don't bother our heads about will we be successful or will we fail. We have to just carry on. And there's a wonderful quote, and I'm not sure where it comes from, where he said, it's so simple. We have to just do what we believe to be right and not bother our heads about whether we're successful or not, because if we don't do what we believe to be right, we'll be doing what we believe to be wrong.
He was against prophets, though. He was against prophets.
Indeed.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
Yeah, which is, this kind of gets into that charting a course between despair and complacency. The slowness of change, certainly, I will even confess to occasionally feeling a sense of despair. If you told me back in, the first Earth Day was in 1970, this month actually in 1970. So it's been a while, right? And if you told me then that we would be where we are now, I would have kind of thought, no, we're going to be so far beyond that. But no, it turns out to be slow. But I think it's also important to remember that in April 1970, the EPA was just being created. The National Environmental Protection Act had passed the year before. They were just establishing the EPA. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, these things were still a gleam in the eye. They were about to be passed. But a lot has actually happened in our lifetimes, in our adulthoods, that I don't think we should shrug that off as being nothing, or it wasn't enough, but it was certainly something. We'd be in a much worse position today had this not happened. Similarly, think about solar power, wind power, some of the technological things that were, again, gleams in the eye, and now are realities on the ground. We still need to, I think, change the constellation of political wealth and power in order to realize these potentials. But these potentials have been demonstrated concretely in a way that they hadn't been back in 1970. So I think we should take some heart from that, without becoming complacent.
But also, things like that the Schumacher centers are doing, there's the real experience of people who are living in a different way, you know, the time will come when people say, we know how to do it. That's great because people have done it. And so we can't wait for the big boys to come and suddenly say, we need to do things differently. And the more people just get on with doing the right thing so that people then know what they have to do when they realize it. That's the important thing.
We have time for just one more question to each of you. And so, Jim, I wanted to ask you, building on this theme of timing and urgency, there's the concept of the Overton window, which is kind of this fictional land in which political change becomes possible, legislation becomes possible to actually pass. Yeah. And universal basic income, a number of questions that have come in are about the universal basic income dimension of this, which, and Barbara, you alluded to AI briefly in your talk as well, is one of the reasons why universal basic income, it continues to be brought up, although it was being considered back in the late 1960s, I believe. So I'm curious, the conversations, if you can just talk a little bit about universal basic income and its relationship here, and are we approaching an Overton window? Will AI provoke us to cross over in ways that give you hope about being able to potentially tie these things together?
I kind of hope that we're approaching an Overton window. I wouldn't put it down to AI propelling that along. There are concerns about automation displacing people from jobs and so on. So that figures in some of these conversations. But I think so just to be clear, what I've been discussing was really universal basic income founded on universal basic assets, right? That would be the way to fund basic income. That would be not a gift largesse from taxing the rich or anything like that. It comes from our universal basic assets. So is there a window approaching for these ideas? I think maybe, because currently we're in a crisis. We're entering into a really, really big crisis. And this crisis marks the end of what some call the neoliberal era, the era of free trade at the international level and free markets being liberated domestically as well. An ideology that was subscribed to by both parties, right? And now one of those parties has totally, for the moment at least, kicked that into the dustbin of history. And I don't think it's going to come back out. I think in the future, whoever's in power, there are going to be some things that are different. And among the things that could and should be different, that would help to respond to the very real needs that people face, are things that would provide basic livelihood security, a clean and safe environment for ourselves and our children and grandchildren, less concentration of wealth and power, more individual and community-based empowerment. These are things that I think really appeal across the political spectrum. And, we may be being peddled now at the moment a lot of snake oil in terms of solutions to those deeply felt needs, but I think real solutions are going to be needed, and this could be part of the mix. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Jim. Barbara, we're going to give you the last word. We just finished celebrating, I believe, the 50th anniversary of the publication of Small is Beautiful, and the coming 50 years are going to be quite a time. And I'm curious if you would share a little about, I'm curious, kind of two things. I'm wondering if you've seen your father's work used in ways that you think he would disapprove of. And, what is it that you think he would want us to take from the guide for the perplexed into this next 50 years, perhaps about the nature of the human or our place in the cosmos? I thought it would be helpful to look forward as we head out from here.
Well, as I said, I hesitate to say what he would have thought or he would say about stuff, although I think he'd be pretty, he'd have a lot to say about the whole AI thing. But I mean, one of the things, and I couldn't talk about everything in a guide for the perplexed, obviously, but the importance, what he was talking about recognizing levels of things, was precisely about solving problems that are irreconcilable opposites. I think we're seeing a lot of that now, and that's the importance of the different, knowing what are higher levels and lower levels of qualities. And the example I think he gives in Guide for the Perplexed is the slogan of the French Revolution, which was about equality. Now I've forgotten. Tell me.
Liberté,
Yes,
égalité,
equality and
fraternity.
liberty. And equality and liberty are irreconcilable opposites. In a sense, that's capitalism and Marxism. And because one is liberty, you can do what you like, and then you get the rich getting rich, and et cetera, and equality is at the opposite spectrum. So how do you reconcile those two opposites? By fraternity, which is a higher value. And so that's why, he thought A Guide for the Perplexed was more important, because if we don't understand about this hierarchy of values and so on, then we can't solve these problems. And that life, as Gandhi said, we spend our time dreaming of systems so perfect that nobody needs to be good. But actually life is about constantly, even in our daily life, of trying to hold two irreconcilable opposites together. And for that and that's why he focused so much in this last book on our inner life, our spiritual life, to help us to understand this hierarchy of values and so on. And so when we're talking about the vertical and the horizontal, if we think all that is equal and everything is relative and so on, then we lose that ability to make those judgments.
That's great. It is a difficult and humbling thing to figure out how to move amorously in this agonistic world of ours. So thank you. Would you please join me in thanking Barbara and Jim for a stimulating conversation. Thank you for being part of this community and this conversation. May the conversation continue. Please join us in the back. Pick up some books while you're here and stay in touch.